those methods that we use work and they are enjoyable. It's not the painful trauma therapy that, most people think in therapy you cry and you go back to pain and it's so
Panic and terror.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
We spend so much time resourcing
Right.
and focusing on what is uplifting and strengthening ourselves and enjoyable. But
Right.
I think that most clients really have a good time in our sessions.
Welcome to the Redbeard Embodiment Podcast. I am your host, Alex Green, and I'm on a mission to bring the power of embodiment to people all around the world. In this podcast, we explore how embodiment practices, trauma healing, and knowledge about the human nervous system can help us find our ground, discover new sources of meaning, and create connection in an ever-changing world. The deepest change is embodied change.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I am happy to be sitting down today with Aleksandra Bazinska, and she is in Tucson, Arizona, and I'm in Boulder, Colorado, as normal. And if you've been around the Redbeard somatic therapy community a bit, you probably know Aleksandra. She has been on the team for at least about 3 years now, one of our online practitioners doing somatic experiencing, internal family systems, and DARE attachment work. And we've had a chance for various conversations along the way, but not a recorded conversation, not a podcast. And so we thought it would be fun to sit down today and talk especially about the theme of developmental trauma. And developmental trauma is sort of one aspect in the trauma therapy world. We sometimes divide between shock traumas like incidences, car accidents, assaults, things like that, as compared to developmental trauma would be things during the developmental years, infancy, childhood, even pre and perinatal in the womb would all fit into the category of developmental trauma. And Aleksandra has just a wealth of experience and expertise, has been studying different ways of working with developmental trauma over the years, talk approaches, touch approaches, nervous system approaches. And so we thought just as that would be a fun conversation just to sort of take a look at what are all the different ways that somatic approaches can support developmental trauma. So very cool thing. I'm not going to try to capture all of Aleksandra's extensive background because extensive is the right word. She originally trained as a psychotherapist in Poland, her home country, and along the way has done lots and lots of the kinds of somatic therapies that you might have heard of: SensoriMotor Psychotherapy, Somatic Experiencing, DARE attachment work with Diane Poole Heller, touch-based approaches with Kathy Kane and Elaine Duncan, and probably about 30 more than that. So I don't know if we'll cover every little piece of your training, Aleksandra, but suffice it to say we have somebody with a long career doing this kind of work. And so, Aleksandra, thanks for sitting down and welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's just begin a little bit with your own background. Like I'm always want to know what brought somebody into doing somatic work, psychotherapeutic work. What's sort of your origin story on those things?
I grew up in Poland in the 60s, and my country was recovering from World War II. And my family especially was really touched by that. My parents were small children when the war began. And my great uncle was in Auschwitz, the concentration camp, from the beginning until the end. So I remember every evening my grandparents with great aunt and uncle would play cards. It was a ritual every single night. And they would watch TV. And inevitably, at some point, there would be something scary, traumatic, or triggering happening, and my aunt would freeze, get really activated, and shout that asking somebody to turn off the TV because she couldn't take it. So I
Wow.
remember the sense of freeze in my body and the sense of terror in the room. Like everything would be electrified and people would stop breathing because the trauma was so present in the room.
Wow.
And my parents were traumatized, neighbors, everybody had PTSD basically around
Right.
me.
Right.
And that was influencing human relationships. I didn't grow up with secure attachment, with understanding parents who were able to be always empathetic or attuned to me.
Yeah.
Everybody was preoccupied with their own nervous system, tension, their problems. So
Right.
I remember a big break in that, an experience that touched me deeply was when a British healer started coming to Poland, and he was offering touch healing.
Mm.
He would see 10,000 or 15,000 people a day. The touch session would last 5 seconds or so. And
Yeah.
people would report cancer remissions or the depression and
Wow.
anxiety stopping or
Right.
all
Right.
kinds of problems. So I was so moved by that and so impressed. I think it really had a huge impact on my life. I think that unconsciously I decided to become a healer of sorts. I wanted to help people. I wanted to make
Interesting.
a difference in people's lives. So I ended up in physical therapy school for 2 years where I learned massage and exercise. And then I moved on to 5 years long graduate school of clinical psychology,
Hmm.
which I wasn't initially convinced because, that was in the 80s. Psychotherapy wasn't as evolved and trauma informed as it
Right.
was now.
Right.
But with time, I fell in love with it. And I started reaching out beyond the basic graduate program and studied Gestalt and Jungian psychotherapy and different forms of body work and meditation. I became a yoga teacher and qigong teacher and breathwork instructor and did all kinds of movement practices from
Right.
India, movement meditation. So, yeah, and my own depression and sense of hopelessness. I remember growing up, I never wanted to be an adult because adults were not very impressive. All of that started changing, and because I was doing many modalities that were embodied, that made me move and breathe and get in touch with what I was sensing within, my life was changing. So,
Hmm.
yeah. So that
Yeah.
was the beginning of long journey of studying many different things. And I think that because I came from such a traumatized environment, I
Right.
studied, I was looking for the most effective methods,
Right.
things that would be helping people to move from misery to happy, satisfying lives.
Right. Wow. It reminds me a little bit of, Gabor Mate speaks a lot about his implicit memories. So, born into Budapest in World War II, active war zone, and he's made sort of some of the same similar uh, um, uh, description about sort of the childhood home and the freeze, frozen in fear sort of energy pervading the family system. And then in his writings, the book of his that I most recently read, his new one, The Myth of Normal, which I love, but he really kind of talks at length about, for him it was like I don't know, mid late adulthood, some where he really started to understand that how that had affected him, being an infant in that environment. So anyway, I'm just here a little bit of a parallel to what I've heard from him.
Yeah, and when we were growing up, the word trauma basically didn't exist.
Right.
When I was in graduate school, we had just very little information about that. I learned about trauma later.
Right.
And then somatic therapies, that's the newest development in psychotherapy.
Right. Yeah. When did you when did you come from Poland to the United States, and what was the reason for that shift?
I came in 1995 and I was invited by Arnold Mendel, a psychotherapist from Portland, Oregon, who traveled to many European countries and taught his methods. And that was also he had a huge impact on me. So I took a 2-week intensive with teachers of Arnold Mindell's process-oriented psychology.
Mhm.
And that was so different than what I learned in graduate school. The way those therapists were listening to you, the capacity of being present. I could feel, I didn't have the words to describe, but I could feel that they were with me. They could sense my body. They could sense my energy, felt my
Mhm.
breath. I
Mhm.
never in my life before felt so met, seen, validated. I never felt so special,
Mm.
empowered
Mm.
as when in contact with people who practice that method. So
It's
I got an invitation to a 5-week-long international intensive in Portland, Oregon in 1995. And then I stayed.
right. And stayed. Wow. Ever since. It seems like there was a big shift in psychotherapy at some point. And there's different people who maybe, and I don't know what you would call this shift, but there's the stereotype of the earlier, more, like, I guess, kind of epitomized by the psychoanalytic perspective, or you think sort of Freudian days, the idea of being sort of a uh, neutral slate. And then later, I forget who coined the term. Was it Erickson, about holding an unconditional positive regard?
Maybe
Um,
Rogers.
oh yeah, that's right. I think it's, yeah, exactly. But then something was shifting, where the idea that the role of the therapist wasn't just to be this
Right.
objective, clean slate, but to be an empathic presence. Uh, and then, later on, this concept of attunement, or this concept of, or co-regulation at the embodied nervous system level, has become more of an awareness. But it seems like just the way you described the feeling of Mendel, it sounds like maybe he was part of that shift that was occurring. Well, is
Definitely.
that how you saw it as well?
Definitely, yes. From thinking that I need to be in a role of therapist and just present myself in a certain way, to
Right.
just being myself and being
Uh,
really present to the client and
right.
really sensing in my body what I was experiencing relationally,
I
how
see.
my body was, how my breath, how my emotions, sensations were responding to what was happening in the client.
Right.
Completely different approach. And not being
Yeah.
the superior therapist, but just collaborating
Right.
together.
What do they? I think they call it human-centered therapy, or
Client
client-centered
centered.
therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. I think it feels a lot better maybe even for both people. I think it feels a lot
I would
better.
imagine. Felt better for me as a client.
Yeah, well, yeah. I think even as the coach or therapist, it feels better too, not to have to be the expert, but to
Right.
be a collaborator.
And
Much
trusting the wisdom of the client, wisdom of
right.
their body,
Yeah,
being partners in the process.
yeah, yeah. Wonderful. I know you did sensory motor psychotherapy. That's Pat Ogden's work. A little, you also did somatic experiencing, and you did touch work with Kathy Kane and Elaine Duncan, the neuroaffective touch. I mean, I don't think we have to cover everything, but like what were some of the main, what guided you to somatic approaches? Was it kind of like you were remembering that British touch guy, or you kind of always knew you wanted to kind of see how the body was involved, or what steered you in that direction?
Having a background in physical therapy as well.
Right.
And first when I came to the United States, my degrees didn't translate. So I wasn't actually planning on staying. I just came for training.
Right.
So being able to do massage was so handy. I was still learning the language,
Right.
and from a massage therapist, you don't need
Don't need to
extensive.
talk. Right.
Right, I didn't have to be very articulate to connect to my clients,
Right.
and so that's how it started. And then I discovered craniosacral therapy, Qigong Song, the Chinese body, mind, spirit, abdominal massage
Abdominal
that
work.
also
Yep. Yep.
focuses on Taoist meditation, working with different mental, emotional states. And then I discovered somatic experiencing through people, and I just knew that I had to study it. It was a combination of many different things that already were important to me.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, let's touch a little bit on this kind of this theme of developmental trauma, and how, it's being talked about more now than even 10 years ago, and certainly more than 20 years ago. And there's sort of new language around it. Like, I forget when PTSD was formally recognized, but at least several decades ago, the formal diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder recognized within the DSM-5 or the psychiatric
earlier.
manual. Yeah, within the United States. But even still today, now there's the concept of CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which usually is referring to the multifactorial influences during not singular incidences, but the effects of neglect or abuse or environmental distress in childhood years primarily. That's typically what the CPTSD diagnosis, but it's not a formal diagnosis. My understanding is I forget the term. It's not the American. There's an international psychiatric thing that has the formal diagnosis, but it's not yet. It isn't in the DSM-5 yet. But even so, there have been many pioneers in the work. For people like Pete Walker, people like Larry Heller, Diane Poole Heller, Kathy Kane, and many others who, Gabor Mate's big in sort of speaking to developmental trauma. So it's definitely in the public consciousness. I mean, probably 50% of my own clients are working with some degree of developmental, that might be a focus, either the direct focus or a tangential focus to the work that we're doing. So it's very much, I believe, what brings a lot of people to psychotherapy or brings them to somatic therapy or somatic coaching. And I know that's true for you too. Well, why don't you share a little bit about, what's different about developmental trauma? I guess, what does that term even refer to? What's included within the concept of developmental trauma?
Well, definitely childhood injuries, whether they happen post-birth or pre-birth,
right,
that last a long time, lifetime, unless we address it typically. Right. And how some people seem to have lived pretty much together life, and then something small happens. Well, small car accident, disaster, nature disaster, and all of a sudden the lives fall apart, or they get divorced, or somebody dies in the family. Yeah. So sometimes that's how developmental trauma comes to the surface, and you cannot not see it anymore, because the coping strategies that before were good enough all of a sudden are not sufficient. So
right.
Developmental trauma can show up through relational difficulties, people who always end up with somebody who is not quite compatible, or lots of breakups, or stay in a relationship that is stable but they are not satisfied and they would rather be alone, or people who are permanently prefer to be alone because relationships don't work. Health issues, chronic health issues often can be an indicator of developmental trauma, especially digestive issues, insomnia, immune system, chronic fatigue, allergies,
fibromyalgia,
chronic pain.
Definitely. And then there's so your name, it could be injuries. To me, a pretty common story is medical traumas. It was fairly common at a young age, and then certainly birth challenges are a big one as well, or distress in utero. And I think probably a while ago people might have been skeptical that sort of those influences that they can carry on into the adult nervous system. But I think now it's pretty well understood that, yeah, the early imprints to a developing nervous system are it's a big deal. It's what happens during those early infant years and even beyond leaves a long lasting impression.
Definitely. And Gabor Mate's story is a great testimonial to that. And then there's a book, The Body Keeps the Score, right?
Right. Yeah.
The body remembers everything. We have cellular memory, tissue memory.
Right.
Even if we cognitively try to forget, the body remembers.
Right. Very much so. So could you speak a little bit about these days, now you're, I don't know, 30, 40 years. I'm not sure how deep you are into your career, but what are some of the ways that you work? I mean, I mentioned, at least through Redbeard, you're doing somatic experiencing parts work, DARE, you probably bring in SensoriMotor. It's hard to not bring all of one's training when we work, but when somebody is new with you, and they know that they want to, they have some awareness that there's been some developmental component. Maybe they're in a functional freeze response. Maybe who knows what. What are some of the ways that you start to work with that? How do you work with people these days?
Well, the first step is always establishing safety in a relationship, establishing connection, and learning where the client is and what they're needing. So,
right.
Every person is very different, and I work with each person differently. With some people, I work more relationally, giving them reassurance, validation, making sure that they feel safe. They can experiment with me in ways that might not be safe in daily life.
Right.
And that I will not disappear. I'll stay with them. I will be the safe space, landing space they can always return to. Right. For some people, I start more with regulating of the nervous system, more from the somatic experiencing angle, where I just keep helping them land in a place where they can be present to right here, right now, right, versus being stuck in the past or escaping to the future, and finding resources within their body, relating to the environment in ways that can support them feeling safe and unregulated, settled, present.
Right.
And then I'm I don't really use fully SensoriMotor Psychotherapy because I work as a coach through Redbeard. Yeah. I do psychotherapy with clients in Europe where there's different licensing, but I use definitely elements where we involve movement. We complete developmental actions like reaching out, pulling, pushing, yielding, and so forth. I love doing also virtual touch, which through Redbeard, it hasn't been very popular, but I spent years studying with Kathy Kane and learned how incredibly powerful it can be to hold somebody's kidneys, adrenals, whether it is in person or virtually. It's still hard to explain how it works, but there's something about sensing that safe touch on the organ that signals danger, kidneys and adrenals, that allows the nervous system to settle, and then all the stressful thoughts just disappear. And there's the sense of connection, relational connection that touch can provide, which is much harder or might take longer through language or other ways of communicating.
Right. Yeah, so true. Yeah, no, what I really resonate with is, kind of like, well, what's the starting point? And I'm a little bit similar in that very commonly I like to begin with, I often will kind of do some nervous system work first, kind of somatic experiencing, partly like that's sort of my way of kind of getting to know the nervous system in front of me, so to speak. It's sort of like, well, what are the things that tend to make a person, rev up a little bit, maybe get a little more anxious, or do they have a tendency to Do they have, are they have a tendency towards going into a bit of a freeze or an immobilization response? It's sort of like, and also what are the reliable things for helping, find anchoring or settling or a resource, whether that's, some people, we work with just simple breaths. And if we pay the right kind of attention to the breathing, it's settling and it's grounding and that's easy for them. And other people, you start kind of exploring the breath, and you have to, it actually can be, a little bit activating. So my style is a little bit like, I kind of want to learn what's the nervous system in front of me, and get a little bit of a felt sense of, all right, what helps create as much stability. It's also an opportunity just to kind of feel like I'm getting to know the person a little bit, even at the relational level. And so that for me, that's kind of off in the beginning. And then things might go into a couple different directions. If we want to work explicitly with some of the childhood experiences, then to me, parts work is such an amazing framework for doing that, because in parts work, it allows us to access the memories, but also include in our conversation, what we in IFS is called the capital S self, or in NARM work, it's called the adult consciousness. But by carrying the sort of the both and of the adult consciousness or witness consciousness and the part, and then what I love so much about a parts work is then mostly it's the person attending to that younger part, and finding out, what was needed that was missing, what reassurance is needed now. It opens this creative space of what would be healing it. It's not about erasing the history, but it's about, can we introduce safety, or some new possibilities. Anyway, so like,
provide the missing experiences.
Yeah, exactly. Provide those missing experiences, get to sort of take that in. And that, we were in that DARE training together with Diane Poole-Heller a couple weekends ago. And you and I were both saying, oh yeah, it fits so well with IFS and in terms of kind of bringing in the attachment, missing pieces and things like that. So,
and the other part, if I may jump in,
the
part that I really love about internal family systems and working with parts is often we have parts of ourselves that we don't understand why they sabotage our actions, why we procrastinate, why we act against our best interests. So IFS has a beautiful way of asking, befriending those parts and learning about what's the positive intention of that part. Why is that part doing that? Right. And once we come from the place of understanding that all parts want the best for us, but sometimes they are stuck thinking that we are 2 years old or 5 years old or 10 years old, and they still think that we live with our parents and our behaviors need to be adaptive to that environment. Once we update the parts, once we validate that we understand they want our best, something shifts and the parts become more open to collaboration and maybe supporting us in ways that are adaptive at our current age.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I love that. And, and to me, there's something that I find myself talking about with clients more often these days. When we're going to do parts work, or we're going to do, DARE style, what was missing, what was needed. And some people just, they intuitively, like, they get it. Oh yeah, what I needed was, I needed somebody to stand up for me, or, if somebody had just noticed what was going on and said, this isn't right. Or, some people, many people organically start to furnish the ideas that would feel very different in the system. Now, some people, I have to do a little bit of explaining on why this is not just it's these methods. They're not just about sort of wishful thinking and hey, pretending everything was fine. That's not it whatsoever. And I talk more and more these days about some of the neuroscience around it and this concept of memory reconsolidation, and how we have just very good neuroscientific evidence that when we engage the implicit memory, that's sort of the body or the memories themselves, in the context of safety, and when we can do that, and when we kind of recruit the right brain and the imaginative experience in the sort of therapeutic setting, or even in somebody's personal, say, meditative space, that when we kind of open up a memory, there is a chemical shift. The neural circuitry associated with those memories becomes neuroplastic for a period of, I believe there's like a 6-hour window where there's an enhanced neuroplasticity to the place where those memories are encoded. And then during that window, having reopened something or working with a part in a really delicate way, or a memory in a very specific way, and if we can bring in these new ideas, what safety would have felt like, what we wish had happened, getting a do-over of certain things, these kinds of repair work, they actually really satisfy needs within that circuitry that weren't met. And then the physiology can change. And then when after that 6-hour neuroplastic window and things kind of settle, reintegrate, that a change has happened even at the structural level of the brain. And so I find sometimes, for people who think, oh, okay, well, how's this going to help me in some tangible way? I refer more and more to that kind of a research. I'm sciencey enough that I kind of always need to have a little bit of an understanding, even when intuitively something obviously is clearly working really well. What do you find? Do you ever sort of face that people have that type of skepticism, or you're explaining in that way, or?
Absolutely, yes. And I love science myself. It helps me, my inner skeptic, to
Right.
see the proof, and then it validates, oh, yes, my experience confirms what the science
Right.
teaches. So yes, with some clients, have you ever noticed that for some people, the concept of parts is difficult?
Yeah.
Or some people don't believe that small shifts, like small regulations of the nervous system, actually would matter.
Right.
And how repetitive, little by little, regulating here and there over time just shifts everything. The organization of experience, the level that their nervous system was used to operating, let's say, in high sympathetic, fight or flight, or being more in the freezy, dissociative, depressive hyperarousal.
Right.
For those little shifts, their nervous system becomes comfortable with more being within what we call window of tolerance.
The window of tolerance, yeah.
Optimal.
Well, there's that phrase, and we say, we hear it in somatic experiencing and related work. This concept that's for nervous system work, slower is faster.
Yes. Less is more.
Yeah, less is more. And I mean, it sounds like, I guess I used to think, well, that's just, that's a nice thought, and we don't want to overwhelm people, so that's a nice way to work. But now so that's true. It is it's much nicer way to work, to not overwhelm somebody. Hey,
Right.
That's a win. But the idea that literally that's more effective. Literally, if we're not going, if we're not creating a stimulus that's too far outside of the window of tolerance, then literally it's digested and integrated and recalibrates the nervous system in a more powerful way. So in fact, it is those. But to me, there's a second ingredient. It's not just the subtle changes. That is, of course, the subtle changes are important if, in my view, if there's a lot of awareness of what's taking place. So to me, when I think about somatic experiencing, like I'll start with a new client and I'll say, hey, let's just take a few breaths together, kind of settle in. Let's take, 2-3 breaths any way you want to, nice and relaxed, no rush, do it in your own way. And I'll say, yeah, let's do maybe 3 or 4 of those kinds of breaths. And then immediately I say, and as you're doing that, does your body kind of like that? Or is it neutral? Or is it a little activating or challenging in some way? And so then they answer that question. And it could be any of those 3. And then we might say again, okay, well, let's do another cycle, another breath or two. And then, and now what are you noticing? So you just did those breaths. What's the after effect in your, what can you sense and feel? And what's amazing to me is that sometimes in those early SE sessions, and we've only done 5 or 6 breaths, not some fancy breath pattern that is proprietary or something, but the difference is paying attention to, and did your body like that? Now what's happening? What's happening next? It's bringing in that active awareness piece. Suddenly it just magnifies everything. And then little things, little changes in the nervous system, when they are observable and understandable, somehow then it creates just a much more powerfully regulating influence. I wonder if you feel similarly, or what your experience is.
Absolutely. So I love the example of taking breaths together that you mentioned. Another exercise that I often introduce at the beginning is orientation. Just noticing objects in the environment, which brings the client into mindful state of being in the present moment instead of in the past and the future, where either depression lives or anxiety. In present moment, when we are seeing the nervous system interoception, always active subconscious scanning of the nervous system for safety or danger cues, it just settles the nervous system. And then the next step could be, well, notice if there's anything in particular that catches your attention, your eyes want to go to, and stay with it. And that's typically even more settling. And then I ask, well, notice what happens in your body as you're looking at that color or the shape. And they usually feel warmth or spaciousness, deeper breath, less thoughts. There's more spaciousness.
Exactly. Yeah. So the interventions are sort of simple. They're not, in a way, but it's the awareness that really can amplify.
And with time, clients become sensitized to good feelings. Often people who are traumatized, especially with developmental trauma, pay more attention to what's wrong, what doesn't work, what's not safe or tense, versus what feels good. So in our work, we really train them to notice what feels neutral, what feels good, orienting to pleasure versus orienting to danger. And that changes how the nervous system starts.
Totally. Well, I mean, so there's that, you've been in pain for a while, you've been stressed out. It's pretty easy to have that so-called negativity bias where you're pay more attention to the things that are uncomfortable or scary or dangerous. And so you're absolutely right. Just kind of working against that bias a little bit. It's like, okay, sure. So there's tension. What else? But what doesn't feel as tense? What feels actually
less tense? Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And increasing that awareness of what can somebody be aware of beyond the stress, in addition to the pain, and amazingly, what that can do to a sort of capacity, or in a way retuning how somebody experiences themselves.
And some people initially don't trust that. They grew up in a violent environment or with a lot of unsafety, and they don't feel comfortable with anything that feels good. So we might need time to gently train the nervous system to learn that it's actually safe. Nothing bad happens when I feel some pleasure or some...
allow myself to feel a little bit of pleasure. Yeah. Well, one of your teachers and mentors for a long time, Kathy Kane, is very well known in the somatic experiencing world for taking many of the principles of somatic experiencing and extending their use largely through touch. And she wrote a beautiful book with
Stephen Terrell.
With Stephen Terrell, right? The Nurturing Resilience, which to me is really an excellent practical framework and guide for the kind of work that needs to happen with a CPTSD kind of nervous system recovery. And I think in that book, they introduce a lot of really valuable language. I think they were the first ones where I became familiar with the concept of the faux window of tolerance, which was really useful for me to sort of understand. But even just the title, Nurturing Resilience, I think is important because it's this idea that the kinds of, how do we make the types of changes at the nervous system level that increase capacity, build resilience? It's not just like something that you just do, like one massage and suddenly you're resilient. That isn't how it works. It's something that's accumulated or nurtured. And a lot of it is this awareness piece. And it's the subtlety done over in a sustained way or over a period of time that can just rebuild the neural circuitry, reorient towards safety, have safety happen at the neuroception level, have those state changes on the inside. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that idea of maybe Kathy Kane's work and perspective around nurturing resilience.
Yes, that's a big topic, and I'm glad you mentioned the faux window of tolerance. So we typically, in order to cope with being either stuck on or off, meaning stuck in the high activation, hyperarousal or hypoarousal, we develop coping strategies that make us feel that we're okay.
Right.
But, we don't have major problems.
I'm fine.
And yet,
yeah.
I'm fine. And then accident happens and all of a sudden we are flooded with emotions, anxiety. We don't know who
I'm
we
not
are.
fine. Why am I not fine? Yeah.
Exactly. So the slowness, that's the wisdom of nature. The tree doesn't grow overnight. It needs to be watered, it needs sun and different elements, nutrients to blossom and grow. Kathy Kane talks about how in our traumatic responses, we either overlink different elements, holding the extra charge in the body. So trauma happens when too much, too quickly,
too fast,
too overwhelming happens.
Yep.
And our nervous system has two basic ways of dealing with that. One is through dissociating. Breaking down the experience so we don't even know that we have charge. We don't feel it. Only when those pieces of that we were hiding the activation, when they come together, all of a sudden the memory, the emotion,
like a trigger, that type of a situation. Exactly. Yep.
And the other way of dealing with this overwhelm is through spreading that activation into many different situations. So let's say one dog was barking at us when we were little, and then we generalize that particular incident into all of the dogs. We are starting to have panic attacks when we see dogs. We call it overcoupling or undercoupling, overlinking the elements of traumatic experience or underlinking.
Right, exactly. Yep.
So with Kathy Kane, we learn how to very gently and gradually approach either those situations or body parts that hold this extra charge, and then discharge, release it, so we can integrate on a level without this high activation. Or we are just holding the elements of experience that are disconnected, bringing them together, so we all of a sudden remember, my father was abusive when I was little, and I was only focusing on his smile or the gifts he was giving me, but actually he did things that hurt me. So I think that's a big part of Kathy Kane's work, to restore capacity of the nervous system to not overreact or underreact.
Exactly. No, I think that's a really good explanation around that over excess charge or you've disconnected. But I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear, I think a lot of people are, they think of therapy and they think of talk therapy and psychotherapy largely as and still the mainstream models in the West certainly would be cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy and talk-based approaches, cognitive top-down approaches. And so I think a lot of people would be surprised, and they might think, okay, well, sure, getting a massage, that can feel nice. Maybe that even relaxes the nervous system. Maybe that could be healing in that way. But that's not exactly what we're talking about when we talk about touch work, somatic touch work, which is much more specific. And maybe you could describe just a little bit around how touch, whether it's virtual touch but I guess for our purposes, thinking about in-person touch, primarily. Why? How does that work? How is it that touch can provide useful support or can help with this work of discharging or reintegrating? How does the touch component help with that?
So when we are born, sensations really, and touch sensations are the first language. We don't have ability to talk. We just feel the world. So
Right.
a lot of our early processing happens on that level. Touch can communicate safety or unsafety, and also a lot of information about ourselves. So we often first feel an emotion in the body before we can name what we are actually feeling. We feel tears, and then we realize, oh, I'm sad.
Right.
Or we have this tightness in the stomach, and then we have the awareness of anger. So
Right.
touch can really help us get closer to our experience and more easily integrate whatever we are experiencing. Help me out here. I think I'm not sure.
No, I think that's really really good. I think that's I think what you're saying something very true, which is that, like, let's use an example of dissociation. So let's say that, let's say that there's a memory or a time period. Maybe it's around. Let's use an example where somebody, not so much abuse, but where the developmental trauma is that that they were undernourished. They didn't either receive enough touch or even just attention from one of their caregivers. Maybe they were busy, or that person was in a PTSD state, so they didn't have a lot of relationship to offer, for example. So, and let's say that if we were just kind of exploring through talk or even through tracking sensation, that a person might get to a point where it's hard to stay with, maybe the tendency to dissociate or to disconnect from sensation. And so, like, to me, that's one situation where I would maybe work with touch when I'm doing in-person work. Is sometimes touch provides a way to stay present to the level of sensation. A person might be able to sort of stay with the thoughts, feelings, implicit memories. My touch might provide safety. That safety might help them stay present. My touch might also bring attention to an area of their body where it's easy for them to disconnect their awareness as part of their disconnecting or dissociating pattern. So, like, maybe that to me is like one tangible example of like how touch might work.
And some people are touch phobic because
Right.
of their history. They will be actually dissociating when you touch them. So
Right.
you really need to establish initially how they respond to touch.
Yeah, and when I'm working online with folks, and of course, I can't offer touch in a direct sense. I do quite a bit when I do SE and other work. I do quite a bit of self-touch, tracking sensation with touch. I think most somatic people work with that as an element. You work with what called virtual touch, and I had a lovely session with you. I remember once where you did that virtual kidney support hold, and it was really cool. And I mean, maybe we could think something metaphysical is happening. Maybe. Another interpretation is that is the power of imagination. So I'm laying there, you're on my Zoom call, and you're sort of inviting this. Okay, and now I'm going to support, under your kidneys with my hands, and so to me, there's a very real sense, and I don't necessarily have to jump to the metaphysical interpretation. I can sort of think, wow, that's a strong intention and a strong awareness on both of our parts. And I know what it feels like to receive touch. And so in my view, maybe that active imagination piece could be part of the effectiveness. But in a way, it doesn't matter as long as you let your skepticism sort of sit on the side. As long as there's an experience that's taking place, for me, it was one of like, there's something to kind of relax into. There's something to settle into. Similar to very similar to what it would feel like if I was there in Tucson with you and you put your supportive, sensitive hands in that area. So do you do a lot of, when you're working virtually, do you work with sort of the person providing touch and you doing virtual touch? Is that common for you?
I've done many sessions like that, definitely.
Yeah.
And I do a lot of Kathy Kane's or Elaine Duncan work, working with organs or tissues, layers of tissues in the body through touch. And I believe that it works through the power of intention. You know, have you ever experienced thinking about someone and then they called you because they all of a sudden thought about you too?
Certainly, for sure.
I have one friend with whom we don't even work on Zoom. We just make a session and offer virtual treatment, and then the other person reports what they were feeling, and they really feel what I was doing, the other way around.
Yeah, very cool.
We live in a quantum universe.
Yeah, I'm not. No, I can go in the metaphysical direction myself personally, but just to me, we could understand it from different levels. I think would be a fair way to say it.
Sure, and visualization is very powerful.
Right. Well, let's talk just a little bit about the DARE approach, Diane Poole-Heller, because you and I were just attended that seminar because she was teaching, which is cool because she doesn't do a lot of the direct teaching anymore. And she's well known for taking attachment theory and bringing, sort of many people have heard of attachment styles: avoidant, anxious, ambivalent, disorganized, secure attachment, and creating a framework, very, very, very experiential. And she'd worked with Peter Levine for many, many years, still does, and she was a faculty for the Somatic Experiencing program for several decades. And so, my view, and I think her view too, is that DARE work is it's very connected in many ways to somatic experiencing, except what's brought into the conversation especially is not only the nervous system but also the attachment system, and that we can learn to sense and feel what is our attachment system doing. And there's this sort of ideal state called secure attachment where we feel a sense of safety. That would probably correspond to the ventral vagal circuitry from polyvagal theory, when we feel safe and we feel connected to self and we feel in safe reciprocal connection with another person. So we wish all babies got to experience that, got to really encode it, because then they would develop later in life having that as their home base. It's kind of the ideal home base in a way. And then sure, conflicts come up. That's an obvious part of life, but it's certainly kind of nice when our default is a place of connection and safety. But what's from Diane Poole-Heller's work, and just attachment theory in general, I think it's something like 40%, maybe, I don't know. These statistics are hard to really know this. Maybe 40% are in that lucky category where they naturally developed this quote unquote secure attachment style. But most people have one degree or multiple ways in which what she calls attachment adaptations, where either situationally or as a default, maybe the person that they're not used to receiving, if they weren't used to receiving, high quality caring attention, then they would naturally be distrustful of that. And so then not seek it out. They might become more independent or look for safety totally from within instead of in relationship with the outside world. Or another example, like the anxious attachment adaptation, where you've had some good examples of co-regulation, but not consistent. So there's this way that it was never quite enough. So you're sort of seeking it out. And I personally just think she does, in her book, The Power of Attachment, is a really accessible way to kind of get her language around it. But both you and I, we chatted afterwards about just how lovely that training has been and how well it fits in with the ways we're already working. But we're, I think, 3 weeks out. What stayed with you from that training?
One thing that's probably stood out the most is how actually easy and accessible it can be to repair attachment adaptations and return to our innate secure attachment.
Right.
And yeah, I studied attachment through SensoriMotor Psychotherapy, and it's way more elaborate and detailed method. DARE is so beautifully simple and easy for clients to get into. The practice is just, I don't know, my body was soaking them up, and I could feel how quickly I was shifting from being a little nervous, practicing with strangers in triad, to feeling resourced, settled, more trusting, more safe in the world.
Right.
And more relationally curious, open.
Right.
So I already use several of the techniques from the training, and my clients love it.
Right.
And then they can use them themselves. That's the beauty of it. Many of the practices from there can be easily also used by clients at home.
Right.
Or
yeah,
practice.
Exactly. And I love, to me, there's in the same way that when we think about the nervous system, this concept of nurturing resilience or cultivating more capacity at the nervous system level, it's like the same. It's a very similar concept for the secure attachment. It's again, it's in DARE, when we're including a DARE lens, we're sort of finding out that, everybody, even though there's lots of ways, most of us have lots of, attachment disruptions that show up as social anxiety and, all the things we do when we're not feeling totally safe, which is common. But most of us also have access to, we know what it feels like when a friendship feels safe, or a connection with our, what it feels like with our, our golden retriever dog or something. And so there's this way that we can use the references that we do have. Well, we do know what safe relationship feels like. Most, almost everybody has some reference points to that type of connection and safety. And so one of the strategies of DARE is, okay, now how can we grow that? So to me, it's nurturing that secure attachment. So, and sure, are we going to get into our attachment adaptations? Of course we are. But again, if we can spend more time oriented towards secure, to me, it's very similar to what we're trying to cultivate in the nervous system.
Right. Cultivating this relational safety and returning back to it, nurturing it, because it grows. Yeah. Versus regurgitating all the conflicts that we had or what went wrong, just choosing to pick what was the moment that felt good in that relationship.
Right. Well, and it even comes into the name. I always say the acronym DARE because the name is so long, Dynamic Attachment Repatterning Experience. I hardly ever say the entire thing out loud, but the name kind of explains a little bit of what it is. So it's Dynamic Attachment Repatterning Experience. So the repatterning experience, to me, those are the important words, where we're looking at times where oftentimes in DARE, we are looking at examples either from the present tense or from history where things were not that great. Maybe, you didn't have enough support, or somebody was overwhelming or intrusive into your boundaries, or something was not kind of as it should be. And then we're trying to create in a session the experience using that right-brained active imagination that we mentioned earlier to really clarify, well, what would have made it just perfect? Like, what would have made it feel just right? And then kind of soak in that experience that you can imagine it, maybe even feel in our relationship, some of the ingredients of secure relationship. And it's like by kind of imbibing that or taking it in, our system can steer in that direction. So that's kind of That's kind of how I'm holding it these days in terms of,
in a way,
why
it's a re-education of the nervous system.
Yeah.
Stop over-focusing on danger and what went wrong and focusing on what felt good, nourishing, right? And Rick Hansen has this saying that we are pre-programmed, our nervous system is pre-programmed to be like a Teflon to positive experiences and Velcro to negative. That's a survival strategy, because it's more important to not recognize danger quickly and to protect ourselves. We will not die by missing something positive happening. Right.
Interesting. So fascinating. Well, good. Well, is anything from just a closing note perspective, anything you think we haven't included, or what I'll let you have the last word. What else needs to be said, do you think?
Maybe briefly, those methods that we use work and they are enjoyable. It's not the painful trauma therapy that, most people think. In therapy, you cry and you go back to pain, and it's so
panic and terror.
Right. Yeah. Right. We spend so much time resourcing and focusing on what is uplifting and strengthening ourselves and enjoyable. But I think that most clients really have a good time in our sessions.
Yep. I think that's important to say. Yeah. Good point. Awesome. Well, Aleksandra, thank you so much for taking time and for all the great work you're doing with your clients. They're lucky to have you.
Thank you so much, Alex. I had a great time with you today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Redbeard Embodiment Podcast. To learn more, visit us at redbeardsomatictherapy.com or send me an email at alex@redbeardsomatictherapy.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, help spread the word by subscribing and sharing with others. Hope to see you next time.